He had waited for months, letters passed, back and forth words that carried the weight of loneliness across miles of dust and prairie silence. The lonely rancher imagined a gentle figure stepping down from the wagon, someone small, someone delicate, someone who would ease the emptiness echoing in his cabin. But when the wagon stopped and the dust cleared, what he saw was nothing like what he had pictured. She was twice his size, broad shoulders, strong hands, 50 years behind her that had been marked not by tenderness, but by rejection and bruised dignity. A woman people called too much and too late. The neighbors whispered, some laughed, others pitied, and for a moment even he wondered, had fate played a cruel trick? This is the first thing you might have missed, that the story does not begin with romance, but with shock, with silence, with two souls staring at each other and asking, what now? And it is in that question that the real journey begins. Then came the crisis, a storm tearing across the valley, a wild horse breaking free in the barn, the town ready to laugh again if the rancher failed. And in that chaos, it was she, the woman scorned as too large, too strange, too old, who walked straight into danger, calmed the animal with her voice, and reminded everyone that strength could look different than they ever imagined. But even victory did not silence the cruelty of others. At church, at the store, in the whispers behind hands, people said the rancher must have been desperate, that no man of sense would choose a wife like her. And so she packed her trunk, ready to leave, ready to accept once again that love was not meant for her. This is the emotional explosion you might not expect, because the real confrontation is not with storms or animals, but with shame, with memory, with the lies she had been told all her life. And the question is, would she believe the whispers, or the man who stood before her saying, I choose you? This is not a tale of young love with fire and fever. It is something rarer. A story of two people at the edge of their years, learning that tenderness can arrive late, but still arrive true. And here lies the heart of your curiosity. When the whole town doubted, when even she herself wanted to run, what did the rancher do to prove that love, real love, does not measure size or age or perfection, but presence? Stay with this story, because what happens after she steps down from that wagon will change not only their lives, but perhaps the way you think about love itself. The prairie wind carried dust and secrets across the town of Dry Creek, a settlement too small for maps, but large enough to carry the weight of whispers. In that place, Clara May lived, like a shadow stretched long, at dusk visible, yet overlooked. At 50, Clara was a woman most folks had already counted out of life's more tender reckonings. Her body was broad shoulders, strong from years of scrubbing laundry for other families, and her face carried the weathered softness of someone who had cried alone more nights than anyone would guess. People in town knew her story, or at least the parts they thought worth telling: how her father had pushed her into marriage at 18, how her husband had drunk his wages and left her with nothing but bruises and silence, how time itself seemed to forget her as the years folded in on themselves. Too big, too old, too barren. The words had been thrown at her like stones, and though they no longer left welts, they remained inside her skin. She carried them the way some women carried pearls, always near the throat, always pressing. Still, Clara refused bitterness. She did not spit back gossip or scowl at the store clerk who shortchanged her. She worked, she endured, and she prayed in her own quiet way. Each evening, she lit a lamp in the single-room cabin she rented at the edge of town, the glow spilling faintly across the worn wood floor. She would sit by the fire, hands folded as if still holding on to something, though what even she did not know. Perhaps it was hope, thin, fragile, but stubborn hope. In another corner of the valley, far removed from the chatter of Dry Creek, Thomas Avery lived alone on his ranch. A widower for nearly a decade, he had known love, once a steady, enduring love, with his late wife, Margaret. But disease had taken her one winter, leaving him with empty rooms and chores that echoed louder in her absence. At 55, Thomas carried solitude the way a man carried a saddle, out of habit more than desire. His ranch prospered, modestly enough cattle to trade enough land to keep him busy, but evenings were cruel in their quiet. He would set 2 plates at supper out of memory, then remove one with a sigh. It was that loneliness, not weakness, that led him to the newspaper. In shaky script, he penned an advertisement that ran for 3 weeks in the Territorial Gazette. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He did not expect a reply, but one came. The letter arrived in Clara's hands on a Tuesday morning, tucked into the postmaster's bundle. She recognized her own handwriting on the envelope she had sent weeks earlier, now answered in return. She carried it home, holding it as though it were something alive, something that might slip away if she pressed too hard. Inside was Thomas's reply, careful words, not romantic, but kind. He wrote of silence and how it pressed against him like an unwelcome guest. He wrote of the way evenings stretched too long without conversation, of the empty chair at his table. And though he did not know her face, he wrote as though he were speaking to her soul. I am not seeking perfection. I am seeking presence. Someone who will not laugh at my grief, nor grow restless with the slow rhythm of ranch life. The words struck Clara with a tremor she hadn't felt in years. Presence. That was all she had ever wanted to give, and all she had ever been denied the chance to offer. For a month she debated. She folded and unfolded the letter until the edges softened like cloth. She asked herself if a man would truly want her, as she was no longer young, no longer lithe, no longer anything the world called desirable. And yet when she looked in the small cracked mirror above her wash basin, she saw a woman who had endured. And wasn't endurance its own kind of beauty? The women at church whispered that she was desperate when they saw her buy new fabric for a dress. The store clerk raised an eyebrow when she paid for the stagecoach ticket. But Clara had learned the art of quiet defiance, to move forward without defending herself, to choose without asking permission. On a bright morning in early spring, she packed her single-trunk modest clothes, a Bible worn soft at the spine, and a quilt stitched by her mother long ago. She tied her gray-streaked hair into a simple bun, clasped the locket she never wore in public, and stepped onto the wagon that would carry her out of Dry Creek and toward a new horizon. The townsfolk watched her departure like spectators at a show. Some snickered, others shook their heads. A few, kinder than the rest, nodded as if to say, "Go on, you deserve this chance." Clara did not meet their eyes. She kept hers fixed on the horizon, where the line between earth and sky promised something beyond the dust. The road was long, each mile stretching with the creak of wagon wheels and the scent of sagebrush on the breeze. Clara sat among strangers, but felt as though she were drifting in a river she had finally chosen to enter. She remembered the years she had stayed still, waiting for life to change on its own. Now, even if disappointment awaited, at least the choice was hers. At night, when the wagon stopped and the passengers made camp, she opened Thomas's letter again. She traced the words with her finger, especially the sentence she had nearly memorized. I am not seeking perfection. I am seeking presence. She whispered it like a prayer before sleep. When the final day came and the driver called out that they were nearing the Avery Ranch, Clara's heart pounded with the weight of both fear and hope. What if he turned her away? What if he looked upon her size, her age, her history, and decided she was not what he imagined? But another voice whispered beneath the fear, softer yet steady, and what if he doesn't? The wagon slowed, dust billowing like smoke around the wheels. Beyond the haze, she saw a man waiting at the gate. He stood tall but slightly bent by years of labor, his hat in hand, his eyes searching. Thomas Avery. This was the man who had written words that felt like balm against her scars. This was the man who had asked not for beauty, but for presence. And now, as the dust cleared, it was time to see if those words could bear the weight of reality. Clara May stepped down from the wagon. Her boots sank into the earth, solid and real. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze across the small stretch of ground between them. Neither spoke at first. The silence was not cruel, but trembling like the hush before rain falls on parched soil. And so began the story neither of them expected, but both had secretly longed for. A story not of perfection, but of presence. Not of youthful romance, but of a late-blooming tenderness that might yet grow in the rocky soil of the frontier. The air between them was heavy with the silence of first meetings, the kind of silence that can bend either toward promise or disappointment. Clara May stood tall, taller than he expected, broader in frame than the fragile figure his imagination had sketched from her letters. Her hands, strong and calloused, clutched the strap of her trunk as though it were an anchor in stormy seas. Thomas Avery felt the weight of his own heartbeat. For weeks he had pictured a woman small and gentle, someone whose presence would feel like a feather settling in the empty rooms of his house. Instead, before him stood a woman who looked as if she could carry half the ranch on her back if asked. The dust lifted by the wagon wheels swirled around them, and for a moment it seemed as though the world itself hesitated, waiting to see who would speak first. It was Clara who broke the spell. "You must be Thomas," she said, her voice steady but carrying a tremor beneath it, like a violin string pulled taut. "And you're Clara May?" He answered his words softer than he intended. She nodded a small, almost shy motion for a woman of such presence. Then carefully she extended her hand. He noticed how large it was compared to his, but when her palm enveloped his, the grip was not overwhelming, it was deliberate, careful as though she was trying not to crush something fragile. "Thank you for writing," she whispered. Thomas wanted to reply with something grand or reassuring, but what came out instead was the plain truth: "I'm glad you came." The neighbors had not expected a spectacle, yet one had formed. A few men leaned against fence posts, arms crossed, pretending to be casual observers. A cluster of women from town, including Mrs. Henderson from the general store, whispered behind gloved hands. Even young Tommy Morrison pointed with wide eyes until his mother yanked his arm down. The judgment was palpable, like a chill that clung to the air despite the spring sun. Clara felt it prick her skin, but chose not to flinch. She had lived a lifetime beneath stares and whispers. Today would not be the day she let them break her. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly and surveyed the ranch. The cabin was simple but neat, its roof patched carefully, the garden tilled, and green shoots peeking through. The fence showed signs of recent repair. It was not wealth she saw, it was care. And care to Clara May was worth more than gold. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "It's a fine place you have here." The compliment eased something in Thomas's chest. He had half feared she would wrinkle her nose at his modest home, the way some women did when they realized ranch life was nothing like the romantic tales spun in dime novels. But she didn't. She looked at his work not with disappointment, but with recognition, as though she understood what it took to keep such a place alive. They carried her trunk inside together. Clara's strength was obvious as she lifted one end with ease. Thomas tried not to feel embarrassed by how little weight remained for him. Instead, he focused on the rhythm of their steps as they crossed the threshold, two strangers stepping into a house that might in time hold something like belonging. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, a Bible resting on the table shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. It was a home prepared for someone, though until this moment it had remained waiting like a book unopened. "I put some tea on the stove," Thomas offered. Clara settled into the chair he pulled out for her, her frame filling it as though it had been made for her. She folded her hands in her lap, feeling awkward and exposed. Yet when the tea was poured and their eyes met across the table, the awkwardness softened. "Your letters," she began, then hesitated. "They were kind." He sipped his tea, the steam blurring the space between them. "So were yours. You wrote about loneliness in a way I understood. I didn't think anyone else could put it into words like that." Her throat tightened. Loneliness had been her companion for so long, she had never imagined it could be shared. Outside, the wagon driver tipped his hat and rode off, leaving behind only silence and the faint creak of the windmill turning in the breeze. The neighbors, sensing no further drama, drifted away with murmurs trailing. The spectacle was over. What remained was real life, the harder, slower part of two people learning who the other truly was. Evening came, laying a lavender glow across the valley. Thomas lit a lamp, the soft light painting the walls in gold. Clara stood at the window, gazing out at the wide field stretching toward the horizon. She felt the enormity of her decision pressing down on her. She was far from everything familiar, tethered now to a man she barely knew. "Is this what you imagined?" she asked suddenly, her back still to him. He was quiet a long time. Then, with the honesty of a man who had grown tired of lies, Thomas said no. "But maybe that's a good thing." She turned, searching his face for mockery, for disappointment. Instead, she found something unexpected: curiosity. That night, as they prepared for bed in separate rooms, both lay awake, staring at the dark. Clara thought of how his voice had not carried judgment when he looked at her, but something gentler, searching. Thomas thought of how she had walked onto his land tall and unafraid, and how her presence had filled the silence in a way that felt less like intrusion and more like completion. Between them lay the vast stretch of uncertainty. But within that stretch was also possibility. and that was something neither had dared to hope for in years. As the lamp sputtered low and the night wrapped around the ranch, both wondered quietly, could this fragile beginning grow into something more? The days after Clara May's arrival unfolded like an uncertain dawn, soft light creeping over the valley, but shadows still clinging stubbornly to corners. She rose early before the rooster crowed and set herself to work with a fierce determination. If she could not be pretty or delicate, she could at least be useful. She scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed chopped vegetables for stew, even split kindling with the steady swing of someone who had known hard labor her whole life. But usefulness was not love, and silence, oh silence, could be cruel. Thomas Avery noticed her efforts. He saw the way she bent over the washboard until her back ached, how she carried buckets of water heavier than some men could lift. Yet the harder she worked, the more he felt a quiet unease. It was as if she were trying to earn her right to stand beneath his roof. One evening he finally said, "Clara, you don't need to prove yourself to me. You're here because I asked you to come." But Clara only lowered her eyes. "I've been told all my life I was too much, too heavy, too loud. If I don't work twice as hard, people, they'll remind me I don't belong." The words lodged in Thomas's chest like splinters. He wanted to say something, anything that would remove the years of shame pressed into her bones. But words alone could not undo a lifetime. The town did not help. When they walked together to the general store, whispers stirred like dry leaves. A woman behind the counter muttered, "Lord have mercy, look at the size of her." A man by the barrels chuckled. Guess Thomas needed someone who could wrestle his cattle. The laughter was low, but Clara heard it. She always heard it. She gripped the basket in her hands until the wood creaked. Thomas wanted to speak up to defend her, but pride, fear, and that old habit of rancher's silence held him back. He settled the account quickly, then led her out into the sunlight, his jaw tight. The shame wasn't hers, it was his. Not for her, but for himself, for being the kind of man who let others set the rules of worth. That night at supper, the struggle came to a head. Clara carried a pot of stew to the table. Her hands trembled, whether from exhaustion or nerves she didn't know. The pot slipped. Broth spilled across the wood, splattering both their laps. She froze, face-burning, red tears already rising. "I knew it," she whispered hoarsely. "I don't belong here. I'll pack my things tomorrow. You don't have to be stuck with a woman like me." The room fell silent, save for the soft hiss of stew dripping onto the floorboards. Thomas stood slowly, the chair scraping behind him. For a long moment he simply looked at her, this woman who had survived so much, yet still expected rejection at every turn. Then he said firmly, but without anger, "Clara, stop." Her eyes snapped up wide and wet. "I didn't ask you here to cook," he continued. "I didn't ask you to split wood or wash floors until your hands ache. I asked you here because I was tired of sitting at this table alone." Her lips parted, but no words came. He stepped closer, setting a hand tentative, almost shy on her shoulder. "I don't need perfection. I need presence. And you're here. That's enough." The words sank into Clara like rain into parched soil. She wanted to believe him. Oh, how she wanted to. But belief is not easy for those who have been bruised by years of dismissal. She turned her face away, whispering, "People will say you settled, that you took the only woman desperate enough to answer your letters." Thomas shook his head. "Let them talk. I've lived long enough to know their words won't keep me warm at night, won't share the quiet with me at dawn. Only you can do that." A tear slipped down her cheek, not of shame this time, but of something gentler. Something that might, if given time, grow into trust. Later, after the dishes were cleaned and the spilled stew wiped away, Clara sat alone by the window. The prairie stretched dark and wide before her, stars scattered like spilled salt across velvet. She folded her arms, holding herself, and let the memory of his words settle inside. "I don't need perfection. I need presence." For the first time in years, she felt the possibility that she was not a burden, but a gift. That her very existence, her being, not her doing, might matter to someone. It was a thought so radical, so tender, she hardly dared to hold it. As the stars glimmered above the quiet ranch, Clara wondered, could she truly be enough just as she was? The storm came without warning. Morning had dawned bright, the prairie stretching golden under a pale sky. By noon, clouds gathered in dark folds, swallowing the horizon. By dusk, wind howled like wolves across the valley, rattling windows and bending fence posts until they groaned. Thomas Avery was in the barn when it began. He'd noticed the horses' restless stamping and snorting at the electric scent in the air. Then a crash split the sky. The roof shingles above tore loose, clattering down into the straw. By the time Clara May arrived, skirts whipping around her legs, one of the younger mares was panicked, eyes rolling, white, kicking against the stall. Rain poured through the broken roof in a heavy torrent, drenching horse and man alike. "Stay back," Thomas shouted over the roar of the storm. "She's wild, she'll strike." But Clara did not stay back. She moved forward with a calm steadiness, her presence filling the barn as surely as the wind filled the rafters. She spoke low words meant more for the frightened creature than for the man beside her. "There now. Easy, girl. You're all right." Her voice carried a rhythm deep and grounding, like a hymn sung through trembling hands. Slowly, carefully, she approached the mare. When the animal reared, Clara did not flinch. She simply held her ground, one palm out, her body a pillar of patience. Within moments, the mare stilled. The storm still raged, rain hammering down, but in that small space, peace settled. The horse lowered its head, pressed its wet muzzle into Clara's hand, as though it had found its anchor. Thomas stood motionless, watching. He had lived his life around livestock, but never had he seen such quiet command, not of strength alone, but of gentleness, of knowing when not to push. When the danger passed, when the horse stood calm and breathing steady, Clara turned. Water streamed down her face, her hair plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes glowed with a fierce, steady light. And in that moment, Thomas saw her differently, not as the woman the town whispered about, not as the wife he thought he had ordered from words on a page, but as a force all her own. A woman who could bend storms without breaking. That night, after the rain subsided and the ranch lay wrapped in dripping silence, they sat together by the fire. Clothes drying, tea steaming, the room smelled of damp earth and cedar smoke. Clara spoke first, her gaze fixed on the flames. "You should know the truth, Thomas. I wasn't just widowed like some may think. I was left. My husband, long ago, he called me useless. Said no man could want a wife like me. He walked out and never returned." Her voice cracked. She had carried this weight for decades, hidden in shame. Speaking it aloud felt like tearing old cloth, rough and jagged. She clasped her hands tight. And I believed him. Every word. For years I believed I was too much and never enough all at once. The fire popped, filling the silence. Then Thomas said quietly, "My wife, Margaret, she was the best part of me. When she died, I told myself I'd never love again. But what I didn't admit, not even to myself, was how much I feared being left alone with my own grief. So I wrote those letters." He looked at Clara, now his face open in the firelight. "You think you were abandoned, and I think I was cursed to be alone. But maybe we both got it wrong. Maybe we've just been waiting different kinds of waiting for the right company." Clara's throat ached with unshed tears. No man had ever spoken to her like this, not in truth, not in tenderness. She whispered, "But what if people laugh at us? What if they never stop?" Thomas leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Let them. They don't wake to the sound of your voice in my kitchen. They don't see how a storm bends to your calm. They don't know the comfort I feel simply sitting in the same room as you. They don't matter, Clara. You do." The words settled in her like roots finding soil. For the first time in her long, bruised life, she felt the possibility that she was not a burden, not a mistake, but a choice. They sat a long time by that fire, two people wrapped in silence, but not the lonely kind. This was the silence of understanding, of wounds named aloud, of burdens shared instead of hidden. Outside, the prairie still dripped with storm water. Inside, something began to mend. As the fire burned low, Clara wondered, was it possible that after all these years, she had finally found a place where her truth was not a curse, but a gift? The storm had passed, but storms of another kind were gathering. At first, the neighbors came under the guise of friendliness, bringing pies, borrowing tools, offering help with the corral. But beneath the politeness lay something sharper, curiosity laced with judgment. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was the boldest. She eyed Clara May up and down as she handed over a basket of biscuits. "My Thomas," she drawled, "you didn't mention your bride was so sturdy. I suppose that'll come in handy for ranch chores. The words pricked like thorns wrapped in sugar. Clara smiled faintly, though inside her stomach tightened. She had heard such remarks her whole life, always dressed as compliments, but cutting just the same. Others were less subtle. At the mercantile, a group of men chuckled as Thomas walked past with Clara beside him. One muttered loud enough to carry, "Guess he figured he needed a wife who could wrangle bulls with her bare hands." Laughter followed. Thomas clenched his jaw, wanting to turn back to confront them. But by the time he found the words, the men had already turned away. Later that night, the silence between him and Clara at supper was heavier than any storm. It came to a breaking point one Sunday after church. As they stepped onto the wooden steps, Clara overheard a woman whisper to her friend, "Poor man. Must have been desperate." The words hit like a hammer. Clara's cheeks burned hot, her heart pounding. She walked stiffly to the wagon, climbed in, and stared straight ahead. Back at the ranch, she could not contain it any longer. She packed her few belongings, her Bible, her mother's quilt, the locket she never wore, and laid them in her trunk. Thomas found her there, her broad back, turned shoulders trembling. "Clara," his voice broke as he saw the trunk. "What are you doing?" She kept her hands busy folding the quilt with shaking fingers. "They're right, Thomas. The town thinks you settled, that you picked the only woman desperate enough to come. I won't have you mocked because of me." She turned then, tears streaking her face. "Better I leave now before you regret choosing me." The sight of her, the woman who had calmed storms, soothed frightened horses, carried scars with dignity, standing there, ready to run because of cruel tongues, ignited something in Thomas he hadn't felt in years. He stepped forward, voice steady. "No, you don't get to decide what I regret." She froze, startled. "I asked for someone to share my life," he continued, "not for someone to impress a town that barely knows its own heart. Let them talk. Let them laugh. They don't know what it means to sit by a fire with you and feel the silence turn soft instead of sharp. They don't know the way you steadied that mare when I couldn't. They don't know you, but I do. And I choose you, Clara." His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from truth. "Don't you dare let their smallness undo what we're building here." Clara stood stunned, the quilt slipping from her hands. No man had ever defended her, not against gossip, not against cruelty, not even against her own doubts. Her knees nearly gave beneath her as she whispered, "You really mean that?" Thomas stepped closer, laying a rough hand gently against hers. "I mean it more than anything I've ever said. I don't need a town's approval. I need you." For the first time in decades, the tears falling from Clara's eyes weren't born of shame, but of release. That night, they sat again by the fire, not as strangers bound by letters, but as two souls who had faced down a greater storm together, the storm of being seen mocked and yet refusing to let go of each other. Outside, the prairie wind whispered against the windows. Inside, for the first time, Clara May felt the warmth of belonging outshine the chill of judgment. As she leaned against Thomas's shoulder, Clara asked herself, could this truly be the beginning of love? Not survival. Spring ripened into summer. The prairie grass swayed tall and green, and the cottonwoods shimmered silver in the wind. Life on the ranch took on a rhythm, not hurried, not perfect, but steady. Clara May no longer rose before dawn to prove her worth. She rose because she wanted to see the sunrise spilling gold across the valley. She cooked not out of fear of failure, but out of joy that someone would sit across the table and taste what she made. The laughter of neighbors still drifted from time to time, but their voices no longer pressed like chains against her chest. Thomas Avery's words had settled deeper than gossip could reach. "I don't need perfection. I need presence. And you're here." And she was. She was fully here, no longer half hiding in the shadows of her own life. One afternoon, as the heat shimmered on the horizon, Thomas brought her to the old oak at the edge of his property. Its branches spread wide, a sentinel that had stood through countless seasons. He carried something small in his hand, a silver band worn smooth with age. "This belonged to my mother," he said quietly, turning it in the sunlight. "When Margaret and I married, we couldn't afford much, so she let us use this ring. After Margaret passed, I kept it in a drawer. I thought I'd never take it out again." His voice caught, but he pressed on. "Clara, I don't want to start over as if we're young. We're not. We both lived too much for that. But I want to begin again with you. Not as a bargain struck by letters, but as a choice freely made. Clara's throat tightened. Her hands shook as he slid the ring into her palm. The metal was cool, but it burned with meaning. "No man has ever chosen me for myself," she whispered. "Not my father, not my husband. Always I was something to be endured or discarded." Her eyes met his. "And you're saying I'm wanted?" Thomas nodded steady as the earth beneath their boots. "Not for your cooking, not for your strength, for you, exactly as you are." Tears spilled hot and unashamed. She pressed the ring to her chest over the heart that had been battered but not broken. Then she stepped forward and embraced him. For years she had carried herself as a fortress, thick walls, locked gates. In that moment she let them fall. She rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the quiet strength of a man who did not need her to be less or more than herself. It was not fireworks, not the feverish love of youth. It was steadier like a river that had carved valleys through time, patient, enduring, inevitable. Days after Clara began to hum while she worked. Sometimes old hymns, sometimes tunes without names. Thomas would pause, listening from across the field, a faint smile on his lips. Neighbors noticed too. When they came to borrow tools or trade eggs, they found the ranch tidier, the animals calmer, the air itself different. Whispers shifted. What had once been mockery turned slowly to respect, some even to envy. "Strange, isn't it?" one man remarked at the saloon. "Avery's place seems to run smoother since that big woman showed up. Never thought it'd work, but it has. Respect, like love, often arrives slow, but once it roots, it holds." One evening, beneath a sky painted in strokes of pink and gold, Thomas and Clara sat on the porch sipping coffee. He reached for her hand, rough and calloused as his own, and laced his fingers through hers. "You know," he said, glancing sideways, "this life, our life, it may not be what the stories tell. But I think it's better, because it's real." Clara smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening with something softer than sorrow. Yes, real is better. And she believed it. For the first time in half a century, she truly believed it. As the prairie darkened and stars began to prick the sky, Clara wondered, was this not only the end of struggle, but the dawn of a love meant to last? Autumn arrived in the valley like a quilt laid tenderly over the land, gold russet and crimson stitched together by a cool breeze. The harvest was good that year. The fields bowed heavy with grain, the cattle fattened for winter. And in the small white church at the heart of the settlement, bells rang one crisp morning, calling neighbors to gather. They came curious, some still skeptical, but curiosity gave way to silence when they saw the bride. Clara May stood at the front of the church, not in lace or silk, but in a simple dress the color of cream stitched by her own hands. A sprig of prairie lavender rested in her hair. She did not look like the brides in dime novels, no corseted waist, no delicate veil. She looked like herself, tall, broad, weathered by years, and radiant in a way that had nothing to do with youth. Beside her stood Thomas Avery, steady and solemn, his hand holding hers, as though it had always belonged there. When the minister asked the vows, Thomas's voice was clear. "I promise not to ask you to be smaller than you are. I promise to share the silence and the sound, the work and the rest. I promise to choose you every day." And Clara, her eyes wet but shining, replied, "I promise to stand beside you as I am, no less, no more. I promise to honor the man who saw me not as too much or too little, but enough. I promise to stay." The church was quiet except for the sound of sniffles. Even Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. For once there was no whisper of mockery, no murmur of pity, only reverence for two people who had turned loneliness into belonging. After the service, they returned to the ranch, now theirs together. A wooden ring rested on Thomas's finger, carved by Clara herself with patient hands, while his mother's silver band gleamed on hers. They walked the fields that evening. The air cooled, the horizon bathed in copper light. The cattle grazed peacefully. The fences stood strong, repaired together. "I used to think love was for the young," Clara said softly, watching the sun sink. Thomas squeezed her hand. "Love isn't about when it comes. It's about who it finds." She leaned against him, the weight of her body no longer a burden, but an anchor. For the first time in her life, Clara May felt not tolerated, not endured, but chosen. Chosen freely, wholly, and without condition. The neighbors' whispers eventually changed. Some said the Avery Ranch had never looked so prosperous. Others said they'd never seen Thomas smile so often. and a few admitted quietly that perhaps they had judged too soon. But by then, Clara and Thomas no longer cared what was said. Their measure was not in gossip, but in mornings shared over coffee and the sound of laughter carried across fields in the gentle weight of another soul beside them at night. As winter's first frost touched the edges of the fields, Clara sat on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders. She looked out at the horizon, wide endless, filled with possibility, and whispered to the wind, "Late or not, love came." And it came just in time. Thomas joined her, setting a mug of tea in her hands. He sat close, their shoulders touching, and together they watched the stars prick open the night. And so in the quiet heart of the Wild West, two weary souls found not just survival, but tenderness, proof that even after decades of silence, life could still bloom. Love could still root deep, and hope could still rise like dawn over the prairie. And as the night wrapped around them, Clara and Thomas knew they were no longer waiting. They were home. And so, friends, what began with whispers and doubt became something deeper than either of them had dared to imagine. Thomas and Clara did not find the love of storybooks filled with youth and fire. They found something rarer, a steady warmth born of scars and silence of years spent waiting for someone who would simply say, "You are enough." Their story reminds us that love is not measured by age, appearance, or the opinions of neighbors. It is measured by presence, by showing up for one another again and again, even when the world says you're too late, too old, or too much. And maybe that is something we can carry into our own lives, to see ourselves and others not for what is missing, but for what still remains: kindness, dignity, the quiet courage to stay. If this story touched you, we invite you to be part of our circle here at None, Wild West Saga. Subscribe to walk with us through more tales of resilience and unexpected love on the frontier. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late. And please leave us a comment. Tell us, would you like to see what happens next for Clara and Thomas, or hear other stories of love that arrives in surprising ways? Your voice, your thoughts, your presence here, they matter more than you know.